We're about halfway through Mark's Gospel, and this morning's sermon is probably the highlight for the whole Gospel of Mark. This is like the central passage in Mark's Gospel. Now, Mark was most likely the first Gospel that was written. And at the very beginning of it, in verse 1, it tells us why he wrote. He says, the beginning of the Gospel of Christ Jesus, the Son of God. Most of the people who have been reading his Gospel would have been non-churched, non-Jewish people, they're Gentiles. And so the idea of the Gospel was to give them a whole lot of background about who Jesus was. Now, Mark is interesting. He obviously didn't have a huge Jewish audience. There's some Old Testament references we find in Mark's Gospel, but it's more likely Matthew's Gospel, the one you want to use if you were trying to evangelize Jewish people, because Matthew has a lot more emphasis on how Jesus fulfilled the Old Testament. But if Mark is trying to the Gentiles, the Old Testament had no meaning to them. It's just another religious book. And so as he goes through the Gospel, he wants to show why Jesus was the Son of God. So as we go through his book, we find that he would cure the sick people. He would remove demons from people. He had power over creation, where he would calm the seas or feed thousands of people with just limited food supplies. He shocked the people when he said that he could forgive sins, and he had power when he defeated death with raising a young girl back to life again. Now each of these stories are there because this is Mark saying to us, I think Jesus was the Son of God because. And so each of these reasons give us. And as we go to the very beginning of Mark's Gospel, right at Jesus' baptism, we're told who he is. So there in Mark 1:11, a voice came from heaven, which is of course God. You are my beloved Son, with you I am well pleased. So right from the very beginning, there's this conscious sense of him saying, this is who Jesus is. He is the Son of God. And for Jewish people, they would have said he's the Christ or Messiah. Now, we look at Jesus' ministry, right from the word go, it's a ministry of conflict. He's not just a happy little camper that everybody loves and who just want to pat him on the back of the head and think, what a sweet boy. There's issues right from the word go. So with Satan, there in Mark chapter 1, the Spirit immediately drove him out into the wilderness in verse 12. And he was in the wilderness for 40 years, being tempted by Satan. And he was with the wild animals, and the angels were ministering to him. And so there's a sense that satanic attack happened throughout his ministry. And the other Gospels give us the full depth of the attack, about how Satan would try and manipulate Jesus to do things his way. I think also at the time of Jesus' ministry, there was a very a powerful influence of demons at that time. So we find Jesus regularly kicking demons out of people. So there in Mark chapter 3, whenever the unclean spirits saw him, they fell down before him and cried out, you are the Son of God. And you're thinking, does Jesus want to be praised by demons? And in verse 12, he strictly ordered them not to make him known. He did not want the praise of demons. And what were the demons trying to do? Trying to release who Jesus was before people grasped what that meant. Why? Because when Jesus says Son of God, he meant this. When other people said Son of God, they meant that. They weren't in the same box. They were using different thoughts about what those things meant. So when you said things like, oh, Jesus will come as the Messiah or the Christ, a whole lot of Jewish people said, oh, great, he's a hero, he'll raise up an army and he'll kill all the Romans and he'll get rid of all the Gentiles. And that was their attitude. And he said, no, I am the Christ who comes to die for you, to save you. It's your salvation, not the Romans, that are the key issue. When it comes to religious leaders, was there conflict? Right from the word goes. There in Mark chapter 2. Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? Says the religious leaders. When Jesus heard it, he said to them, those who are well have no need of a physician, only those who are sick. I have come not to call the righteous, but sinners. And this is an absolute dig at these religious leaders, because they would have all seen themselves as being the most righteous people out there. And they would have been quite happy to have the title righteous for them. And Jesus says, you guys already saved yourself. You don't need anybody else's help. I've come for those who struggle and those who sin. And of course, the reality is we all are sinners. But the religious leaders in Jesus' day did not see themselves that way. And so we find after a healing in Mark chapter 3, the Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him on how to destroy Jesus. And this is a bit like saying, Just recently at Parliament House, Pauline Hanson grabbed the Greens and said, we need to get stuck into Malcolm Turnbull. And you start thinking, what would Pauline Hanson and the Greens would ever have in common? What would the Herodians and the Pharisees ever have in common? They were the poles apart, but their hatred of Jesus drew them together. When Jesus looked at these religious leaders, this was his insight into what they were like. He said, the people honour me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. They would go to the synagogues. They would pray prayers. They would look religious. They'd look pious. But Jesus' response was, their heart is far from me. Their body was present in the synagogue, but their heart was not. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. Now it's interesting, in verse 7, it's very subtle. In vain do they worship me. He doesn't say in vain do they worship God, because it's a very strong link between Mark saying that Jesus consciously knew that he was the Son of God the whole of his life. And he knew that when people worshipped God in the synagogue, it was him that their worship was meant to go to. And so it says, in vain do they worship me. They would say pious prayers to God, but they had no meaning. And he goes on to say, you leave the commands of God and you hold on to the traditions of men. They invented their own religion. And if there's a whole lot of parts of the Bible you don't like, the problem is not God, the problem is yourself. Then after a mass feeding, so Jesus, we see Jesus feeds the 4,000, feeds the 5,000. He does these great events. Thousands are impacted by what happens. And what was the response? The Pharisees came and began to argue with Jesus, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. And you kind of say, go figure, he's just fed 4,000 people with a couple of loaves of bread. What other sign do you need? Now, he's doing something which is up there with what Moses did, and you're whinging. As Jesus says in verse 12 that he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, why does this generation seek a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation. And you look at those words and think, well, did not Jesus make blind people see? Did he not make deaf people hear? Did not raise people back to life again? Are they not signs? Yes, they are to those who can see. But for those who reject it, there is no sign that Jesus could ever do that would change their mind. Possibly if he did jump off the temple and land safely, is what Satan had suggested to him, they might be impressed with things like that. But they weren't impressed with godly behaviour by Jesus. And it's interesting, I know when I talk to people who are very anti-Christian, all the evidence in the world will not change their presuppositions. If in your head you say there is no God, all the arguments I give to you hit that wall of there is no God. And so you don't come to the person with a neutral playing field of saying, let's honestly share truth together, because they're already started with a position they will deny the truth you have. So then you've got to say to yourself, how did the people respond? How did the people react to Jesus? There in Mark 1. They were all amazed. So they questioned among themselves, what is this? A new teaching with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits and they obey him. The people just knew something new was happening. Or in Mark 2:11. And so they're all amazed and they glorified God and saying, we have never seen anything like this. Jesus did not come to repeat the same old of the past. He came as a refreshing new wind of transformation. He was not just a better rabbi, a nicer synagogue leader. They knew everything was different. And when Jesus looks at his ministry, he wants to say to them, I'm not just coming here to do the old things in a nicer way. I'm here as a breath of fresh air. So in Mark chapter 2, no one sews a piece of unstruck cloth onto an old garment. If he does, the patch tears away from it. The new from the old, and a worse tear is made. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is destroyed. So all the skins. But new wine is for fresh wineskins. This whole imagery that Jesus is saying, I'm a fresh piece of paper. Everything is brand new. The old has passed, the new has arrived. Things are going to change. And as they looked at Jesus and what he did, his disciples in the boat with him, the storm is calmed. And they look to each other and say that even the wind and the waves obey him. In other crowds, like the ones where Jesus kicks out the demoniacs, their response was they begged Jesus to depart from their region because they were scared. Well, in Mark 8, Jesus charged them to tell no one, but the more he charged them, the more zealously they proclaimed Jesus. They were astonished beyond measure. Isn't that great? They were astonished beyond measure, saying, he's done all things well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. Jesus was changing everything they did, everything they thought. He was coming in and making these massive paradigm shifts in how they did religion. Now for them, one of the most things that they were greatly obsessed with was the Sabbath day. On the Sabbath day, they just had rule after rule after rule. Some of their rules were to manipulate the Sabbath, like they were told you were not allowed to walk so far from their front door. And so another of these guys said, great, what I'll do is I'll make a detachable front door and I'll carry it in front of me so I can go as far as I like because I have not walked past my front door. And so they manipulated things. So there's all this great debate that they did about the Sabbath as if that was the most important thing. And Jesus says the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Those things that you hold most sacred, I'm still in control of those things. What about his family then? If he's in this much conflict, if the people love him, the religious leaders hate him, where did his family stand? In Mark chapter 3, his family heard it and they went out to seize Jesus, for they were saying, he is out of his mind. We've got to take him home. He's a bit nutty. He's going to embarrass everybody. And then in Mark chapter 3:31, his mother and his brothers came and stood outside. They sent to him and called him. And the crowd was sitting around him. And they said to him, your mother and brothers are outside seeking you. And he answered them, who are my mother and who are my brothers? And looking around at those who sat around him, he said, here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of God, he is my brother and sister and mother. But that's not the end of his family, because his mother at the foot of the cross is there, has been put into John, the disciples' care, and it appears that she had made a faith decision. Two of his brothers wrote two of the books in the New Testament. Obviously they made a faith decision. But imagine for a lot of members of his family, their conversion to following Jesus, because he's their brother, happened after his resurrection. What about his own village? How did they respond? Now, most people get really excited if you have a celebrity in town. And if you've got a celebrity, you can say, oh, that person comes from Newport. You get really excited. They're saying, he's one of us. He's one of our locals. But in Mark 6, it said, he came to his own hometown and began to teach in the synagogue. And many who heard him were astonished, saying, where did this guy get these things from? What is this wisdom given to him? How are such great works done by his hands? Is he not the carpenter? Is he not the son of Mary, the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? Are not his sisters here? In their response, they took offence at him. And Jesus was able to say, a prophet is not without honour except in his own hometown, among his relatives and in his own household. And he could not do many mighty works there, except that he laid hands on a few sick people and healed them. And he marvelled because of their unbelief. We know you, Jesus, because I remember when you were a little kid. I remember you in kindergarten. I changed your nappies. How dare you be the Son of God? You don't fit the box that I have. So all these things happen in Mark's Gospel. As we come to this passage today, which is our central one, Mark 8, verse 27. We find Jesus has been out teaching, he's been preaching. He's now walking alone with his disciples. And Jesus went out with his disciples to the village of Caesarea Philippi, and on his way he said to his disciples, who do people say that I am? It's quite often Jesus' questions, not his answers, that show him the greatest depth. Their response: some people think you're John the Baptist. Why would they say John the Baptist? Well, John the Baptist has been killed, and they don't have the internet like we have today and great communication and newspapers, and so news travels badly and not well. Now, Jesus and John the Baptist were cousins. They were family, and they were tied right from the moment they were born, as we find in Matthew's Gospel. They both came from the same reason. Jesus had been spoken highly about by John the Baptist, and his own followers were unsure whether John the Baptist was the Elijah to come. Now, why was Elijah picked? Elijah is a great prophet from the Old Testament. In a moment we'll go into some more details into him. But the last verse in the Old Testament is Malachi chapter 4 verse 5. Behold, I'll send you Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. And he will turn the hearts of fathers to their children and the hearts of children to their fathers. Lest I come and strike the land with a decree of utter destruction. And so there's this thought was John the Baptist the Elijah figure that was going to come before everything happens? And they're all uncertain. And when John dies, they think, well, maybe it wasn't him. Maybe Jesus is the Elijah figure who is to come. So there's great uncertainty about who it will be. Now about John the Baptist, what does he think about Jesus? Back there in Mark 1:7, and John preached, saying, after me comes one who is mightier than I, the strap of whose sandal I am not worthy to stoop down and untie. I baptize with water, but he will baptize you with the Holy Spirit. And so this thought was, is Jesus John the Baptist? If he's not John the Baptist, is he John the Baptist-like? They're cousins. Maybe it's like a family tree that father follows son, that regularly in business you'll find that when a member of the family gives it the business, that maybe a brother or a cousin or a child will take the business over. Maybe there's this link happening there. The second choice, they said, is others think that you're Elijah. And if you go back to the beginning of Mark's Gospel there in Mark chapter 1 verse 2, it says, it is written in Isaiah the prophet, behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight. And of course that's linked to that verse in Malachi about the idea that Elijah will be coming, there'll be somebody who will come and speak. But Jesus used this verse not of himself, but of John the Baptist himself. Now, God had not spoken to the Jewish nation for about 400 years. Malachi is the last book. Some of the Jews thought that God had forgotten them because there had been no voice from God. So John the Baptist preaching in the wilderness was a thought that God had not forgotten them. So why Elijah? What's the background? If you go to 1 Kings 17, we'll find that Elijah is a prophet. He's the first key prophet. He appears in a challenge against the evil king Ahab, who ruled the northern kingdom about 874 to 853 BC. Now Elijah prophesies that a great drought will come across the whole land as a consequence of Ahab's evil. And it does happen, as it had been preached. Now Elijah goes and hides near a brook where he's fed by ravens. As the drought and the famine deepens, Elijah meets up with a widow in a neighbouring country, and through her obedience to Elijah's request, God provides enough food for Elijah, the woman and the son. Now miraculously, the woman's barrel of flour and jar of oil never run out, which is in 1 Kings 17. We turn to 1 Kings 18. There's a face-off between Elijah and the king. So 3 years of drought have happened. The king is absolutely furious with Elijah, thinking it's all his fault, this drought. And so he meets on Mount Carmel, where the false gods of Baal and him go into a battle of power. They set up some sacrifices there. The Baal people pray and pray and pray. Nothing happens to their sacrifice. Elijah throws bucket after bucket of water over his sacrifice, and the whole thing explodes into flame. So Elijah calls upon God, and God sends the fire down from heaven, burns the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and licks up the water even in the ditch. God proves that he's more powerful than the false gods. It was then that Elijah and the people killed all the false prophets of Baal. After the great victory over the false prophets, rain once more falls upon the land. And Ahab's wife Jezebel makes a vow to kill Elijah. It is then Elijah in fear goes and escapes to a mountain. There he prays for God to speak to him. It says there's a great wind, an earthquake and fire, and God says, I'm not in the wind, the earthquake and fire. Then a still small voice comes and speaks to Elijah, and he understands that God's hand is upon him. So Elijah is seen as this great, significant, powerful prophet in the Old Testament, that Malachi has predicted a man like him will come and speak again. And the people have this fervent desire to think, let's get rid of the false teachers, let's get rid of the Romans, let's get rid of the Gentiles, let's have a purified faith back in Israel once more. Now, the third choice they had was, if you're not John the Baptist, if you're not Elijah, maybe he's just one of the prophets. Maybe he'll be a prophet like Joel, who will inspire them with the Spirit of God being poured out, or like Isaiah, who will preach of messianic hope, or Jeremiah, who reminded that there's a new covenant coming, or Ezekiel, that the dry bones will come alive again. Maybe Jesus is one of these type of guys. Would not any Old Testament prophet speak with the passion and power that Jesus had spoken to them? Did not Jesus' miracles point out that God was with him? The people would say, was not our hearts on fire whenever he preached? Did we not love to hear his words? Did we not want to get right with God after we heard him say things? We know something different is happening here. Who is this man? Therefore, Elijah, a prophet, John the Baptist are all good choices for who Jesus should be. But Jesus turns around to his disciples and says, but who do you say that I am? And I'm not surprised that Peter is the first one to put his hand up and speak. Jesus comes to walking on water, and Peter says, can I go out and walk on the water with you? He does it. When they do the transfiguration, Peter puts his foot in his mouth and says, how about I build some tents, we can stay here forever. Peter's a guy who impulsively speaks regularly before his brain has been put into gear. And this time he speaks very quickly. And Peter says, you are the Christ. What does that word mean? Christ is the Greek word for the Hebrew word Messiah. Messiah means God's anointed one or chosen one. The whole way through the Old Testament, the thought was that God would send one special person. When Jesus comes, we realize the special person is also his son. And Peter says, you are the Christ. It's interesting, the next thing that happens is that Jesus strictly charged them to tell no one about himself. He says, be quiet. Now, what word strictly charged? Other ones have warned. Some might say sternly ordered. Other translations admonished them, ordered them, strictly forbade them. But oddly enough, it's the very same word that that Jesus uses when he rebukes the wind. He got up and strictly charged the wind, or rebuked the wind. When Jesus kicked demons out, it says Jesus rebuked or strictly charged them, the demons. And so it's probably the most strongest, powerfulest word is do not, under any circumstance, tell anybody about me. And you're kind of wondering, why is that? Because everybody had a false understanding about the term the Christ. And why is that? Because Jesus goes in the next part to explain exactly what Christ meant. There in verse 31. And he began to teach them about the Son of Man. Now, Son of Man is one of the terms that's often used in the New Testament. And it doesn't mean, Son of Man because he's God's son, and Son of Man he's man's son. Son of Man itself is a title within itself. And a lot of the translations for this passage here would have man with a couple of M instead of a lowercase m to express the distinctiveness of it. Now that's in the English text. The Greek text is all uppercase, so it doesn't have that subtlety. But in English, the translators have tried to do that. So where's that idea of Son of Man come from? Daniel 7, verse 13. The clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man, that term again. And he came to the Ancient of Days, a term for God, and presented himself. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, for all peoples and nations and languages shall serve him. His dominion is everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom is one that shall not be destroyed. What does Jesus say when he says Son of Man? I am the one who has a kingdom of all nations and power and languages. I am the one who has a kingdom where everybody will serve me, and my dominion will be for everlasting, everlasting to eternal. And then Jesus describes the reality of being the Christ, the Messiah. He says, I will suffer many things. And in your head you think, but you're the Messiah. You are our hero. You shouldn't suffer at all. And then it goes on to say, I will be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and I will be killed. And I imagine if the disciples really took this to heart, at this moment it's as if they've been kicked in the gut, thinking, how can you die? But then Jesus has this next line, after 3 days, I will rise again. Yes, he knows he will die, but he also knows there's a resurrection. And as he said this plainly, very plainly, clearly, he's made it obvious. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke Jesus. You know, you're kind of thinking, who would ever go up to Jesus and say, look, I'm sorry, Jesus, you're wrong. You've got no understanding about God. I really need to tell you about God. But turning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, get behind me, Satan, for you're not setting your mind on the things of God, but the things of man. Peter could not grasp that Jesus would have to die. And you can see it as we go through the story. When Jesus tells his disciples he's about to die, Peter goes and buys a sword thinking, I'll fight him off. I'll get rid of a lot of them. You will not die, Jesus. But Jesus knew what was going to happen. Then he goes away from the small group of disciples back to the large group with the crowd. And there in verse 34, calling the crowd to him, with his disciples he said to them, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up the cross and follow me. There's a sense that the call to Christian life is one of service. One possibly of difficulty. Of times that we need to swim against the tide. It was interesting last week, and I do it often. I was down at Newport Beach for my morning swim. I jump in the water. I tend to try and jump off exactly opposite the front door of the surf club. That's my point of knowing where I am. And within 5 minutes, I was probably 150 metres down the beach. And so I jumped out of the water and got back out and walked back down to the front of the surf club, jumped in the water again, 150 metres down the beach. I ended up doing it 4 times. So I ended up joking with the other guys, I can swim like an Olympian. You should see how fast I can go down the beach with the rip. And on the last time I thought, I'm going to go against this rip and just see how hard it is. And it's phenomenally hard. The swim in the rip is an absolute breeze. No difficulty at all. Just to walk against the rip is nearly impossible. And I walked and walked and walked, and I looked and realised I was still in front of the club door. I had not made any distance. I was lucky to keep in one spot. You and I are called to swim against the tide of our society. Our society will say things like, same-sex marriage, everyone knows it's okay. And we're swimming against the tide. Everybody knows it's okay to rip off the government, and we're swimming against the tide. It's only white lies, it's not a bad lie, we swim against the tide. There are time and time again that we will have to stand up for our faith. And he called his crowd and said, if anyone will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever will save his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel will save it. Then he goes on and says, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? And what can a man get in return for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man also be shamed, when he comes in glory of his Father and the holy angels. Years ago, we had a man and his wife who wanted their daughter done, religious thing for the sake of the grandparents. As they all came to church, got their kids baptised. The dad was a highly successful businessman, had a whole lot of people work for him. He lived in the most beautiful street in Maroubra, and they had a great swimming pool, big 2-storey house, everything they could possibly want. And as the minister was trying to share with him about gospel things, at the very end of it, the guy said, by the way, thank you for doing the baptism. I should give you some money as a thank you. So pulled out a $5 note and said, look, I'd like to give you $5 towards your church. And the minister said, thank you very much. We'll use it for one of our charities. And I think the man nearly thought, yep, that was pretty cheap. It only cost me $5 to get the kid done. That's a cheap thing. It's like a meat pie. And there's this real sense that he had no need for God. 2 weeks later, he was in church again. But this time, it's the funeral of his child. He's now saying things like, I would give up my house if my child would come back. I'd give up my wealth if my child would come back. There's nothing I have on earth that has any value if only my child would return. What does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? There are things that we have, and they're great, but they're not meaning. They're not our purpose. They're not what makes life come together. It is Christ and Christ alone at the centre of our life that makes a difference. Why is this passage so powerful? There's 2 parts to Mark's Gospel. The first 8 chapters shows everything to prove that Jesus is the Christ. The next 8 chapters that we will go through will show why does this Christ have to die for you and I. And the next time that Jesus is called the Christ or the Son of God is when there's a Roman soldier at the foot of his cross. Jesus dies, and the soldier will say, surely this man was the Son of God. Mark wants you and I to know exactly who Jesus is. The Lord of Lords, the King of Kings, the Master, our King, our Saviour and our Redeemer. The one that we call upon, our rock, our foundation, our strength to our very soul. Let's just bow our heads in prayer. Father, this is a very powerful passage of the Lordship of Christ. Father, forgive us for the times that we don't let you be Lord of all our life. Forgive us for the times when we hold on to sins that we know that should not be there. Father, may we be holy and consecrate all of ourselves for the building of your kingdom and to your service.